This is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, and in this talk, I'd like to provide students with some help making their first reading through Chapter 2 in Aristotle's Categories. I want to warn students in advance as we get into this study that it's very difficult for modern students, especially older students. It's very difficult for modern students to understand the categories because their minds are so dominated with thoughts of material things, with thoughts about modern natural sciences and so on, that when we come to the categories, many people immediately begin thinking that we're categorizing things in the natural world. And that's not what we're doing in Aristotle's Categories. Where does this book fall in our library of classical studies? This is a textbook on the art of reasoning. This isn't a book on natural philosophy. This isn't a book on any natural sciences. This is the first book of Aristotle's work on reasoning. And where does reasoning take place? It doesn't take place outside of us. It doesn't take place in the world. It takes place within us. It takes place in the soul. And so you've got to make sure that that's clear, that in the categories, Aristotle is not trying to organize plants and animals and other things in the material world into different classes. We might do that in natural philosophy, but that's not what we're doing here in the study of the categories. We're studying the art of reasoning, and reasoning is an operation of the soul, something that takes place inside of us. Now, what we're doing is we're trying to understand this power of reasoning. We're trying to develop it so that we can use it and make the most of it. It's a power that's given to us by nature, and yet just like our muscles, it needs to be exercised and developed. We all have muscles, but we're not all strong. And those who work to get the most out of their physical bodies have to learn about all different subjects: nutrition, weightlifting, cardiovascular fitness, rest, on and on. All different fields of knowledge are necessary to learn how to get the most out of our physical bodies. Well, in the study of the art of reasoning, we're seeking to learn how to get the most out of our souls, how to make the most of this power of reasoning that we're given at birth, but which is corrupted and hindered by our sin and all of the weaknesses of human nature. So we're seeking to learn how this soul of ours works so that we can exercise it and develop it and strengthen it and make it as powerful as it possibly can be, to allow it to fulfill God's potential for it in us. So remember that everything we're reading about in this book of the categories is not about things outside of us, but it's about things that are inside of us, things that exist in the soul. And we're going to see that very clearly here in chapter 2. And I want to make sure that that's clear before we get into this. Now, once we get into this chapter, now that I've explained that, now that you're conscious of that and you're expecting that, you're going to see how clear Aristotle's teaching is here in chapter 2. And you might have just read right past this stuff had I not stopped you and made sure you had this idea in focus before you started reading. So let's go ahead and get into chapter 2 here. And again, this is chapter 2 of the Categories, the first book in Aristotle's Organon, which is his complete system of methodical treatises, we might call them, in the art of reasoning. Chapter 2 of the Categories. Aristotle writes, "Of things which are the subject of discourse, some are enunciated according to connection, but others without connection." And like I said, you might have read that first line and just zipped right on into the paragraph without really catching the important message that the chapter starts with. Of things which are the subject of discourse. Of things which are the subject of discourse. That is, of things which we speak about. Of things which we speak about. Now, what is it that we speak about? We don't speak about things that are outside of us. That's really not how language works, and Aristotle explains that. There's a process by which we think of things and speak of things, and it goes like this. All around us, outside of us, there are material things, bodies, bodily things, primary substances. We're able to perceive these things. We're able to observe these things by means of our senses. And our senses are like receptors. And our soul is like a piece of film in an old film camera. The way that a camera used to work is that there would be a piece of light-sensitive film inside the camera, and it would be dark inside the camera, and then all of a sudden, the eye of the camera would flash open and shut in just a millisecond. And the light that would enter into the camera would make an impression upon the film. And the impression of that light upon the film created the photograph. Remember, a Polaroid camera, and I know some of you guys may have no idea what I'm talking about, but a Polaroid camera could actually produce that photograph immediately and print it out. That was quite a high-tech device. But normally, with our old film cameras, we had to roll up or wind up the film that was inside the camera and bring it to a photo developer who would actually take that film and turn it into photographs. And the word photograph means writing with light. We were using light to draw on the film and then using the film to create photographs. Modern, or I should say younger students, aren't familiar with that process because they've been raised in the smartphone age where we simply click photos and we just keep digital photos all over the place and we rarely print anything. We just share the pictures in digital format. So if you think about the way that old film cameras worked, the film is like the soul. And the eye of the camera is like our eye, which is open and receives the light that comes into us from the outside world. And the images, or the things I should say, the things that are outside of us absorb and reflect light to create images. And those images, through the sense of seeing, make an impression on the soul. Now, the problem with a photograph is you can't hear the sound, you can't smell the smells that are present in the scene, in the photo, you can't feel anything. You can just see the picture. But God designed us so that our souls would not only receive the impressions of sight, but also the impressions of sound and smell and taste and touch. And so all of the five senses are receiving information, as it were, and making impressions on our souls. And our soul collects and keeps these impressions And then the faculty of reasoning begins to work on them, to process them, and to seek to order them. Remember, the wise man seeks to know order in things. And so the soul collects all of these impressions and then naturally begins ordering them. And it orders them by comparing and contrasting them, by saying this goes with this doesn't go with this, and so on. And that's called the process of judgment. Judgment is the joining or disjoining of ideas in the soul. Now, if you think about those ideas in the soul, that's what we speak about. Spoken words are signs of the impressions of the soul. Spoken words we use as signs to name and speak about those ideas that exist in our souls. We speak about ideas. Therefore, when Aristotle writes at the beginning of this chapter of things which are the subject of discourse, of things which are the subject of speech, of things which we speak about, he's referring to ideas. And that's why I said it's very important to understand that Aristotle is not categorizing things in the natural world. He's talking about ideas, of things which are the subject of discourse, that is, of ideas. Some are enunciated, some are spoken according to connection. Some are spoken in a connected way. But other ideas are spoken without connection, that is, separately, by themselves, or simply. Some ideas are enunciated according to connection. They're spoken in conjunction with other ideas, or others are spoken without any connection, that is, by themselves. Those which are enunciated according to connection, some examples of things that are spoken in connection are such as, quote, the man runs, unquote. The man runs. That's an example of an idea spoken in connection. The man runs. Another example, the man is victorious. The man is victorious. That's an example of something spoken according to connection. So this phrase, according to connection, may be a little awkward, but it simply means some things are spoken in conjunction. But other things are spoken without any connection. Simple ideas. He says, those spoken without connection are such as man. Just that single idea, man. That is an example of a thing spoken without any connection. Man, the name of a single thing. One idea spoken simply, man. Another example, ox. Another example, runs. And a fourth example, conquers. These are examples of things spoken without connection. Ideas spoken separately, simply, without any connection to any other ideas. So Aristotle makes this distinction between things spoken according to connection and things spoken without connection, And it's important for you to understand that in the categories, we're studying things spoken without connection. In the categories, we are studying simple ideas, simple spoken things. Things spoken without connection. Things like man, ox, runs, conquers, and so on. That's the subject of the categories. In the next book of the Organon on interpretation, we'll begin studying those things which are spoken according to connection. On interpretation, we'll learn about propositions, which are judgments that are spoken. But in the categories, we're studying simple ideas, ideas without connection. So you see, just in those first 2 sentences, there's a lot of important information packed in there that you've got to make sure you understand, and you don't just start reading through this stuff and miss the whole point. Aristotle's writing is obscure, intentionally obscure. And what that means is he's not intending this as some kind of logic for dummies book. Aristotle's not interested in pretending that he's going to teach dummies. Aristotle wrote these books, or at least these books were compiled by Aristotle's assistants, and they were intentionally obscure. They require careful study. They may even require an experienced teacher to guide a student through them. And you've got to be sure that you read carefully and that you make sure you understand every sentence that you read before you move on to the next sentence, or you'll quickly be lost. Make sure you understand every sentence, and if you don't, ask for help. There's a lot of information packed in these sentences, and it needs to be unfolded or opened up. That's what it means to expound something. It means to open it up. So let's continue. Of things, likewise, some are predicated of a certain subject. Some are predicated of a certain subject. Some things are spoken of a certain subject. So we have a subject and a predicate. The predicate is that thing which is spoken of the subject. So think of them as separate, simple ideas which are simply connected. That's what the sentence is, the proposition. 2 ideas are simply joined together, like the man, that's the subject, is, that's the connection, victorious, that's the other idea. So there are 2 simple ideas, man and victorious, and the verb is simply joins them together, and that's what enunciative speech or judgment is. Some things, notice it doesn't say all things, it says some things are predicated of a subject, of a certain subject. But they are not in any subject. Some things are predicated of a certain subject, but they are not in any subject. Now, the verb are not in this sentence, and I'm going to say this as a warning in all of the reading in this course. Anytime you see the verb is, or are, or is not, or are not, you've got to be careful because the verb can be translated in a number of different ways. And sometimes if you read a sentence and it's got the verb is or are in it, and you just feel like it doesn't make sense, try reading it again and replace the word is or are with exists. Exists. Another philosophical term that's used is subsists. Because that verb, think about it, in Latin the verb is esse, to be. That's the verb that's being used. That's where the word essence comes from. So existing and being, if we think of the simple meaning of this verb, is or are, that same verb can also express the idea of existing. A thing exists or subsists. So keep those words together in mind. And if you read a sentence that has that verb is or are, and it just doesn't seem like it makes much sense, think about whether you can replace it with exists. And sometimes you'll see that if you read it with exists, the meaning of that sentence becomes clear. And that's the case here. So think about this sentence. Some things are predicated of a certain subject, but do not exist in any subject. Some things are predicated of a certain subject, but are not in, do not exist in any subject. And then we're given some examples. So we're going to see there's 4 different classes of spoken things that Aristotle speaks of here in chapter 2. He's going to describe each of these 4 different classes of things, and then he's going to give us some examples. Now, the descriptions, especially when you're just getting started, the descriptions are confusing. It's hard to understand what he's talking about when you don't already know his philosophy. But the examples that he provides often are more helpful in understanding what he's talking about than the description. So make sure you carefully think about the description he gives for each of these 4 classes, but also the examples that he gives, because I think the examples often make more sense of Aristotle's teaching than the descriptions sometimes do. So the first class of things are things which are predicated of a certain subject, but are not in any subject. And he then gives this example or explanation. He says, thus, man, there's your idea, man is predicated of a subject, namely a certain man or an individual man. That's another thing to note. Anytime that Aristotle, in the translation at least, uses the word certain, it can be translated individual. So man is predicated of a subject, namely of a certain man, of an individual man, but man does not exist in any subject. Man is not in any subject. Man is a substance. It's not in any subject. And man can be predicated of a certain thing, of a certain or individual man. But it's not something that exists in a subject, like an attribute. It's a substance itself. So we have the first class of things described and illustrated through an example here by Aristotle. Next he says, to explain this further, he says, other things are indeed in a subject. Other things do exist in a subject, but are not predicated of any subject. Some things are indeed in a subject, but they are not predicated of any subject. And now he pauses here to explain this concept a little bit. So first he describes the second class, and then he says, hold on a minute, let me explain what I mean here. He says, by being in a subject, I mean that which subsisting in something, not as a part, cannot exist without that in which it is. By being in a subject, I mean that which subsists, and subsist and exist can be pretty usually used interchangeably. Subsist is more of a philosophical term we don't use very much, so you may want to just replace it with exist to help understand things. By being in a subject, I mean that which subsisting in something not as a part. So it exists in something, but he's saying, I don't mean it exists in it like a part exists in a whole. I'm using exists in something or subsists in something in a different sense. Not as a part subsists in a whole. I mean that which subsists in something and cannot exist without that in which it is. A thing which cannot exist without that in which it is. And remember also, sometimes the preposition without can be translated outside of. I mean that which subsisting in something cannot exist outside of or apart from that in which it is. Now he gives an example. Thus, a certain grammatical art is in a subject, namely in the soul. And when you're first studying Aristotle, this stuff can be really confusing. You read a certain grammatical art, and you say, okay, I think I know what that means. And then he says, is in the soul. And then you say, never mind, I don't understand what he's talking about. But he's saying a specific art, skill in grammar, exists in the soul. Remember, not as a part of the soul, but it exists in it in a way where it cannot exist outside of it. That's the only place that it can exist, is in the soul. And so it has a certain relationship to that subject. A certain grammatical art, one grammatical art, is in a subject, namely in the soul. But that certain grammatical art is not predicated of any subject. And so this is an example of this second class of things. He gives another example. He says, this white thing is in a subject, namely in a body. And again, you've got to understand what this language means. When he says this white thing, it's as if he's pointing to something that actually exists. That's what the word this means. It's a demonstrative pronoun. It points out or shows some individual thing. This white thing, not a white thing or any white thing or all white things or some white things. He says this white thing as if he's pointing to some specific thing, some specific or individual white thing that actually exists in the material world. This white thing. It is in a subject, namely in a body, because the whiteness cannot exist outside of a body. White doesn't exist by itself. It's an attribute. It has to exist in a body. And that's why he says, namely in a body, for all color is in body. And remember, change that verb. For all color exists or subsists in body, but it is not predicated of any subject. Is not predicated of any subject. Why? Because it's an individual thing. And we'll learn this more later. In our everyday life, we don't think about these things. But when you say this is such and such, the thing that you use in the predicate is never an individual thing. If I say Socrates, that's an individual thing, an individual man. Socrates is, what can I say about Socrates? I can't use an individual thing as a predicate. What I normally use as a predicate is either a substance that's more general, like Socrates is a man, Socrates is an animal. I can predicate something more general of Socrates. I can name a class of things to which he belongs, or I name some attribute. Socrates is Greek. Socrates is wise. That's how predication works. And it's this process that Aristotle's drawing our attention to. So that was the second class of thing. And just to review that, other things, he said, are in a subject, but are not predicated of any subject. Let's move on to the third class of things. He says, but some things are both predicated of a subject and are in a subject. Some things are both predicated of a subject and are in a subject. And remember to play with that verb are and read it like this. Some things are both predicated of a subject and exist in a subject or subsist in a subject. The use of is and are can be misleading, and it's something you've got to always think about when you read. Some things are both predicated of a subject and exist or subsist in a subject. And he gives us an example. Thus, science or scientific knowledge. Science is in the soul as a thing in a subject, as something in a subject. Science is in the soul. Science exists in the soul. And it is predicated of grammar. Because we say grammar is a science. Science is a thing more general than grammar. It's a class to which grammar belongs. Grammar is a science. So science is an example of a thing that is existing in the soul as in a subject, but it's also predicated of a subject. So science is an example of this third class of things. And then he comes to the fourth and final class. He says, some things are neither in a subject, that is, they do not exist in a subject. Some things do not exist in a subject, nor are they predicated of any certain subject. Some things are neither exist in a subject, nor are they predicated of a certain subject. For instance, a certain man. And remember, I just explained that when he says certain man, you see, we use this in English to mean actually the opposite. We use it to mean an uncertain man, some guy, a certain man. A certain man walked into a bar. We use that phrase, a certain man, in a way that's different from the way that Aristotle uses it. And remember, this is just an English translation. When Aristotle says a certain man, he means a specific individual man, one man, an individual man. Some things are neither in a subject, nor are they predicated of a subject. For instance, a certain man. So, William Michael, I would be an example of a certain man. Socrates, the one and only, is a certain man. You are a certain man. It means an individual. Individuals are this fourth kind of thing. Or the second example he gives, a certain horse. A certain horse. So if you can think of an individual horse, like Alexander the Great's horse, whose name was Bucephalus, and that specific horse, that one horse, that individual horse, or if you're driving down the road and you see a horse in a pasture, that horse, that is what he means by a certain horse, an actual individual horse. These are the fourth class of things. And he says, for nothing of this kind is either in a subject, either exists in a subject, or is predicated of a certain subject. And in short, he says, individuals, individual things, and remember, individuals are things that actually exist materially. Individuals, not classes of things, not abstracted ideas, but individual things that actually exist. Individuals and things which are one in number are predicated of no subject. Yet nothing hinders that some may exist in a subject. For a certain grammatical art, one grammatical art, is among the number of things which exist in a subject, but are not predicated of any subject. So, in chapter 2, the first thing we want to focus on here is that Aristotle is speaking in this art of reasoning about things which are spoken. He's speaking about ideas. Images or ideas in the soul that have been collected from impressions received through the senses. These impressions are signs of the things that have been perceived or sensed. And when we speak, we use names to communicate and share these ideas. And he says there's two kinds of speech. There's one kind of speech where we talk about things in connection, like the man is victorious. And there are other things, or another way of speaking is when we speak of things as individual notions or ideas, like man and victorious. And then he says, now of these simple things, of these things spoken without connection, we can divide all of them into four classes. And you can draw for yourself a chart with four quarters in it and map this idea out that Aristotle is explaining here. There are four classes of things, and let me just quickly review them. The first class of things, those which are predicated of a certain subject but do not exist in any subject. That's the first class of things. Secondly, those which are or exist in a subject but are not predicated of any subject. Thirdly, things which are both predicated of a subject and exist in a subject. And fourth, some things that are neither in a subject nor are predicated of a certain subject. So make sure that as you study this chapter, you learn these four classes of simple, that is disconnected ideas. Four classes. Make sure you learn the description for each of these four classes, and make sure you learn the examples. You should memorize at least one example and associate it with each class so that when you think of the different classes, you can quickly think of the example, and that will help you to remember it. So again, just to review one more time. The first class, the example was man. Man. which is the name of a genus, man, the name of a class. And that sort of gives away what this first class of things is. Man is the example of the first class. The second class, things which are in a subject but are not predicated of any subject. The example he gave was this white thing or a certain grammatical art. They were the examples. Then the third class, which are both predicated of a subject and exist in a subject, science was the example that he gave. And then lastly, things which are neither in a subject nor are predicated of a subject, he gave a certain man. And you can just think of Socrates, an individual man. Okay, so those four classes of things. Simple things, or I should say ideas, which are spoken without connection. And the study of these simple things, just ideas by themselves, without any connection, without any judgment, just the ideas themselves, the simple notions themselves and their names. That's the subject of the categories. So this is what we're going to be studying through the rest of this book. And when we get to the next book on interpretation, we're going to start studying things which are spoken in connection, things which are enunciated, propositions or sentences. I should say enunciative sentences. We'll learn what all that means later on. But I hope that this was a helpful walk through this second chapter. This is a difficult chapter to study on your own. And what makes it difficult is that there's so much important information packed into these sentences. And this is one of those chapters where if you can understand this chapter clearly, I would even say to memorize this chapter. If you can understand this chapter, everything else is going to make clear sense in the categories. And if you rush through this chapter and don't really understand it and don't make the effort to understand every single sentence, you're always going to be fumbling around in the categories and in the other works on reasoning because you missed the point of the first lessons. So take your time, study this lesson for mastery, ask any questions that you have. If there's anything as you go through it you still really don't get it, use the student forum on the course page in the study center and post all of your questions. And I promise you, I'll answer them in detail. If you post and I don't answer in a day or two, send me a quick email and just let me know that you posted on the forum because I might have missed it. But post all of your questions on the student forums because I'll answer those questions in detail, and I can afford to do that because when I do so, other students can benefit from it at the same time. So study this lesson for mastery. Ask any questions that you have. Make sure you understand every single sentence. And when you feel pretty good about your grasp of this chapter, then go ahead and get the assessments finished and submitted so you can move forward in this study. I hope that's a helpful walk through this important chapter. Let me know if you have any questions. God bless your studies.